Very nice. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I wish I could unbutton my shirt and show you an Elon t-shirt too. I only got the hat back in 2001, which was my first visit here. So many of you have been here 3 times in the last 3 years. I have been here 3 times in the last 15 years, which I guess goes to show you what a hot ticket I am. It takes me 15 years to get back. But you know, the words that you, and I appreciate, Tim, how over the top you were, but what you described is what, and I know I'm not here just talking about Elon, but there's a lot of stuff that the PR people here do that's really very effective. And more than being effective in terms of public relations, it's actually true. So I don't know how President Lambert feels, but he must have felt he died and gone to heaven when he came here in '99, because everything was set up, and all he had to do was make it better, which is not necessarily easy to do. But the story that George Keller tells, I admit I haven't read your new introduction to it, Leo. So these #1 things, they come from U.S. News and World Report. But they're based on stuff that goes on here with students. So as some of you have reminded me, I have used on occasion Elon as illustrations in talks and in things I've written. And one of you reminded me that once I said, well, that's enough about Elon, and you were sitting in the audience saying, no, it is not quite enough about Elon. But one of the I guess, current manifestations of the commitment that this university has to the quality undergraduate experience is hosting this meeting. I mean, you have to look a long way to find an institution that would put up resources for the betterment, not just of its own staff and students, but for the larger community of practice, right? So this is very unusual in the sense that a place that's doing so well would also contribute to the larger good. So it's a salute. Leo gave me this hat in 2001. It has perspiration stains on the inside. I have worn this hat literally all over the world. And on a boat river trip in Berlin, there had to be 2 or 3 families that came up to me and said, oh, my daughter's going to Elon. So enough about Elon, right? So last night, Brad's presentation, which was terrific, mentioned the Gallup-Purdue poll in a way that got us interested in it. So I want to ask you, this is an audience participation. So what institution out of this list had the largest percentage of its grade? Now remember, if you weren't here last night, the Gallup-Purdue poll is a study of college graduates who report on the nature of their undergraduate experience, the kinds of things they did, and then they also cross-tab that, if you will, with their success and well-being in the workplace, right? So it's a matching of what matters to life, what matters during college to life after college. So which of these institutions had the largest percentage of graduates who said, I had a mentor? E? B? B is in, how many say A? Carleton College, great. Northfield, Minnesota, right? Huh? Elon. I don't think you were in the study, were you? Stanford, gotta be Stanford. Wake Forest, right down the block. I thought I'd throw that in there just to get a little hooting and hollering. And Western Governors, did someone say Western Governors? Now wait a second. Now this is the social science stuff. If none of the above is an option, it often is the correct, right? So those of you who said Western Governors, why did you say that, Peter? Now this is playing to Brad's point about are these really mentors or are they something else? Now, I'm casting aspersions. I don't mean to do this intentionally in Western Governors. But and this is an entirely online program of study. Put that in your mind's eye. So it exists everywhere and nowhere. So when you enroll at Western Governors University, you are assigned a mentor, which may or may not comport at all with the things you've been talking about here. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. I'm saying in most other instances, the term would be what? Advisor. So one of the early things they said was, this is amazing that Western Governors University will have this close, personal, meaningful relationship with its students, and well, maybe it does, maybe that's supposed to be a little fun, fine, okay. So my thing is I'm here to talk a little bit about high impact practices and how that dovetails with the many things you've been talking about in much greater depth. This is a book that everybody should have on their shelf. By the way, this is the first thing, that's the 2008 piece that Tim mentioned. But since that time, AAC&U and other people have been pushing more and more information out about these so-called high-impact practices. And one of the most important pieces, and you've talked about this in different sessions here, is the effects that participating in a high-impact practice has on underserved students. So if you've not seen this piece by Ashley Finley and Tia McNair from AAC&U, it is one of the more impressive pieces. It's a multi-institution study, and what they found was what we have found throughout in HIPS, unusually positive effects. Come back to that in a second. So here's the list, and I call this, so many of you are sick of seeing this list, but the officially approved list of high impact practices, and I've obviously bolded here and emphasized undergraduate research inquiry, and with apologies to the humanists in the room, I was an undergraduate English major. That's what I wrote my senior thesis on, which is buried. And by the way, Tim, thanks for mentioning that 1980 piece, because I thought you were going to say, and that's when he was learning how to write. I thought that's what the illustration was going to be. But if you count the number now, we have 11. And I'm going to come back to Eportfolio at the end, if you're still here with me, because I think what we're going to see in the next couple, 3 months is AAC&U officially adding this to the list for reasons I'll explain later. But I want you to be thinking about, those of you who've had conversations, who've played around with things like ePortfolios, to be thinking about the role of the ePortfolio in deepening and extending the impact of an inquiry experience. And for things we'll talk about a little bit later. So HIPs, as we've come to call them, are important because if you've done one as an undergraduate, you benefit in substantially, empirically demonstrated positive ways. I'll show you some data later that you'll be tired of looking at. One of the main reasons, one of the so-called causal explanations is most of them actually require students to show what they've learned and demonstrate how what they have learned can be used in a way inside and outside the class. And then they have these compensatory effects, what the McNair and Finley piece demonstrated, that not only do almost all students benefit positively in unusually positive ways, but the students who benefit most are the students who are least well prepared for college, come in with lower, if you will, academic achievement patterns, typically from not typically, but from low income groups, first in the family. We call these compensatory effects because they have a boost on the performance of students, and you've had conversations here about the role that undergraduate research plays in that. And finally, if you do more than one, there is a cumulative accentuation effect that occurs. I'm going to show you this later. And the reason I'm mentioning this now is I want you to be thinking not only about the thing you came here to talk about, how important undergraduate research is, but in the mentoring role, what's the responsibility, obligation for making certain that students know there are other kinds of activities that can have a very positive effect on the quality of their learning and such. So, and now I'm just getting started here, just to the overview. So I want to spend just maybe 2 or 3 minutes reminding us about the nature of the world we're preparing students for, and then the relationship between these high impact practices, deep integrative learning, And then some things we've learned mostly from NSSE. And this is going to be kind of a repeat of what many of your sessions have been talking about. You know, what does an engaging, high-quality undergraduate activity look like? And I should apologize, there'll be a heavy emphasis on social science, STEM stuff, and less on the creative arts. And then some implications to move along. So never before, I guess anyone could have said this at any point in history, never before have we expected more from an educated citizenry. Whereas 30, 40, 50 years ago, my daughter reminded me of the other day. She said, well, when you graduated college, you could have got a job anywhere. You know, this was in the late 60s, and the economy was, she was right about that. Actually, darn right. You should have seen my undergraduate record. Anyway, but I did get a job. But today, you know, there's less willingness on the part of employing organizations to say, come on in and we'll invest in you for 6 months. You know, we'll bring you up to speed. What they want more and more, they want people who can hit the ground running, as we say. And of course, all we need to know from listening to the TV the last 2, 3, 5, 8 weeks is we need a highly educated citizenry to cut through a lot of the malarkey that we, not just here, not just in the political season, but we're just awash. So what do we know about, broadly speaking, about the nature of people who make their way later? Tony Carnevale, some of you, probably all of you have read his stuff, maybe not associating his name with it, but he's there in Georgetown, and he and his colleagues, you know, they spend all of their days and nights churning up millions of data points about what people who survive and thrive in the workforce look like. Where they work, the kind of work they do, where they went to school, what they majored in, and then their career progression, how much money they're making, are they advancing in their careers, and so forth and so on. Now, I see you taking pictures of the slides, which is fine. But the slides will remain, but I won't. So if you want to take pictures, I'd be the person. So there are a lot of conclusions they do. By the way, you'll have the slides. You can post them, do whatever you want with them. Where was I? Anyway, they are, you draw a lot of different conclusions. Some of them are conflictual. But one of the statements they have made, and they've made it again and again, and remember, these are people, they're now talking about people who are being successful post-college. In some important ways, not every important way, but some important ways. What they say is it doesn't make any difference what you majored in terms of the likelihood that you're going to survive, thrive later. I know this, we don't like to think of this, but 3, 4, 5 years out, what you majored in becomes irrelevant typically, and it doesn't make any difference where you went. Now, none of us wants to believe that either. What makes a difference is whether you come out with what they call this broad set of cross-cutting capacities, which can happen anywhere. Granted, I think when we set up a curriculum in a certain way and when we expect students to do more and more applied experiential learning with all the things that you've been talking about, you're more likely to see these benefits accrue. That's very, very important. So what are they talking about? Well, they're talking about a number of things, but and certainly they're talking about the AAC&U so-called essential learning outcomes. I'm not going to go through the first 3. You know them pretty well. You can pick up your own catalog and read. What we don't talk a lot about, at least it's hard to write about, it's certainly hard to explain to new students and parents perhaps, is this notion of deep integrative learning, which I'm convinced it's the gateway to lifelong learning. I think this is the secret to making one's way in a world that is got a churning, you know, evolving, rapidly changing economy. And what does it represent? Well, it represents lots of different things. No one has, to my knowledge, a validated measure of deep integrative learning. But if we stop and ponder it, and the people who do a lot of writing about it, a lot of them are from Australia, New Zealand, some in Western Europe, it's the capacity, it's the demonstrated proficiency, right, in getting to the core of a language or of a problem or of a study. It's putting what it is we've learned in our own words, right, and it's putting things together in different ways that presently may not exist. And you ought to begin to see some of what it is you're trying to do with undergraduate inquiry to feed right into trying to understand the evidence here and different patterns of behavior out of a data set or a particular way of looking at a current phenomenon, and then taking this information and using it in different situations, which creates maybe a different understanding of what those data said, what those findings may have said in the first place. All of these things, this is my short version summing up of what the world needs now, what your students need now, is the essential tasks for me at my stage of life. How do we, where, in what situations do we require, that's a strong word, students to think aloud about their own thinking, which I submit is an unnatural human act. Learn to be sure, but to think about the impact of not just what they're thinking, but what's occurring around them, and then taking what it is they've experienced over time, new syntheses and understandings, and applying it. Where do students get experience doing that during the undergraduate years, and then connecting the various dots and sets of experience in their lives? And how often? This is not a one-time, let's wait till the senior capstone seminar. This is an ongoing process. So students get better and better and better at it. I think undergraduate, and one of the reasons I think we call undergraduate inquiry a high-impact experience is if we do this well, if students are doing these things, they in fact are getting a much deeper appreciation for what they've learned, but also seeing what they can do with it. Yes, so where does this miracle occur? How does it happen? Well, we've played around with it over the years with NSSE, as was mentioned earlier. And because no one has an empirically validated measure, we made one up. I mean, that's what applied social scientists do, right, Brad? I mean, you don't do it because you're in real science, not me. I'm applied social science. So we made up a set of questions that we think if a person is practicing some of these kinds of cognitive and metacognitive processing, where would they get the experience? How often, for example, do we, as I'll say classroom instructors, ask students to bring together specifically ideas from different classes, different readings, things beyond the current syllabus? How often do they talk about ideas with their teachers outside of class? Well, I suspect if you're mentoring undergraduate research, you're doing that all the time, right? How often do students get practice applying some of these theories and empirical investigations to problems in their own life? Point of all this is we created a scale, called it a deep learning scale, and it's simply how often the student says they have been asked or they've done these things in the last year of their studies, right? And we find, and this is what led us initially into the so-called HIP world, right? When we looked at these data, here's the deep learning scale. It's essentially a summation of how often students say they do these kinds of behaviors, if you will. And then there's some other scale. But let's just focus on deep learning. And obviously I've, again, bolded, underscored undergraduate inquiry. What you're looking at here is the difference between students who have done one of these and students who've not. And the advantage here is to students who've done it. So what we're showing with these plus, by the way, I should say, everything that you see on this chart is statistically significant. Doesn't that kind of give you goosebumps? Everything is, and of course, some of you know that the size of the data set matters. And so we have 4.5 million students in the data set. So any question we ask comes up with a statistically significant. Then that's why we've used what we call in the business effect sizes to represent the magnitude of the difference between those who do and those who don't. And in my business, you almost never see 3 or even 2. It's almost representing like a full standard deviation difference between those who've done one of these. And by the way, these are each individual. It's not a student who's done all of these, because that person would be zipping around, be at Pluto by now probably. So effect sizes. And so you see the benefits here from these things that we call high impact practices. And the reason is because students who do an undergraduate inquiry program, look at this, I mean, across the board, they are much more engaged in almost every aspect of their undergraduate experience, not just the research project, right? So we've got this kind of ballooning set of effects. That's, when we first ran these data back in '06, I said, well, there's something wrong here because these things are coming out. I said, well, there's a mistake, there's a problem with the algorithm. And we ran it, and they've been running these data now for, what, 9 years, and the patterns are the same. And now there may be self-selection going on, just as there is students who choose to do undergraduate research. We need to talk about that. But the patterns are unmistakable. They are consistent and persistent over time. And some of you have talked about this in your own work, on your own campus and other studies. What happens when students do one of these? What's the relationship to their persistence and graduation rate? So this is Cal State University Northridge, which some of you know as a Hispanic majority university these days. And so they were very curious. And this was one of the first kind of very powerful findings coming out of the CSU system about 4 years ago. No, it's longer ago than that. So what you're looking at are 6-year graduation rates. I know this is pretty exciting to most of you. 6-year graduation rates. If you've not done, if you're a Latino and you've not done a high impact practice, fewer than 4 of 10 who start somewhere finish in 6 years at CSU Northridge. But if you've done just one, that number is now almost half of that group of students is graduating. And if you've done 2 or more, you begin to see this cumulative effect where you now have 2/3 of the students finishing. Now, at some of your campuses, you might say to yourself, 2/3, that's not very good. But if you are a Hispanic serving institution in the CSU system, this blows the top off because they're middling around the 30s, sometimes low 40s. So, and you can see a similar kind of a stepstone effect here for other students. These data have now driven the CSU system to try to figure out, and they're investing, $9–10 million a year trying to get this is a 23 campus system, trying to get other campuses to figure out how to weave at least one high impact practice, make it a requirement in their general education program. In fact, they're working now, CSU, with the National Association of System Heads in that project. And we mentioned the compensatory effects. So here's this bottom line here is a baseline of kind of aggregated learning gains. Don't get me started. This comes out of the Finley and McNair study. So these are students who've not done a high impact practice, and this is essentially what their average gains look like when aggregated by different racial ethnic groups. If you've done 1 or 2, you get a boost in your learning that's around 10 to 12% greater. Are you with me here? Kind of following this, it's kind of make-believe. But if you've done 3 or 4, there's an additional boost for virtually everybody, up to a benefit of maybe a quarter, 25% on average, greater gains across the board. Then you see what happens when you get up to 5 or 6. This is simply a representation of the cumulative effect. I'm not trying to talk you out of focusing your entire career on mentoring undergraduate research. What I am saying is you're going to get a bigger boost, and students are going to benefit even more if you can begin to tie 2 or 3 other kinds of practices. The SUNY system, 64 campuses, now is requiring every student to have at least one. They can't bring themselves to use the word HIP, so they call it an applied learning experience. But this is by administrative fiat, and campuses have Well, we'll see. Last month, they were supposed to have had every campus a plan for how they were going to pull this off at scale, applied learning. Undergraduate research would count, as would an internship, field placement, other things. And employers love this stuff, right? So you think about yourself, and sometimes we wonder, is there any kind of concrete, practical application? Well, I'm not sure employers are going to want to hear so much about the research project that your mentee has done, but they're sure going to want to hear about what they've learned about solving problems and applying what it is they know and how they know it to situations and circumstances that are facing this particular firm at this point in time. All things that we can squeeze further out of the work that you are doing. Completing a significant project, more than 8 out of 10 say, yeah, that's pretty important. In fact, almost 2/3 say, it would tip the scales in terms of hiring somebody. Developing research skills to their field. So there's lots going on here. Well, here's Gallup-Purdue. Can't read this from the back probably. Again, we heard something about this last night, and we were bemoaning the fact that only 22% on average across all these 30,000 college graduates said they had a mentor, right? Where we are, 22%. But remember, Western governors had 80%. So you just changed the name of your advisors to mentors. But the experiential piece is what matters to well-being in life and in the workplace post-college. I worked on a project that took a semester more to complete. A third of the people who were reporting high performance said that they had done that. I had an internship or a job. I was active in extracurricular activities, but only 6% of 30,000 people said they did all three. And these were the highest, the people who were most satisfied with their work and were apparently doing very, very well in college. Well, the reasons that undergraduate research matters, as well as these other what they have in common is, this is the stuff you talked about at 11:15 this morning, you talked about it a little bit last night, so this is not a particularly, startling list to you. But keys here are the expectations and the amount of time and effort students invest. We've seen this across, some of these other high-impact practices, like learning communities. The students taking the same 2 classes together. On average, they spend, I didn't believe this either the first time I saw it, 20% more time a week preparing for class. If you're in, and we don't have statistical controls on this. Students just say so we don't even know how good the learning community is or how well organized and so forth is. So all of these things matter, and you can see your own work, I think, in mentoring represented on most of these bullets, particularly the feedback piece, right? And the reflecting on learning. I'm going to come back to this in the context of the research experience here momentarily. But here's John Dewey. I'm sure you recognized him. We can label activities and experiences, but what really matters is how well they are done. Our part as the mentor, the undergraduate inquirer, him or herself, right? And so we know that these aren't the only, I got 3 pieces here, so there's much more to this puzzle really, but it is this significant amount of time. It's not so much time matters, it's effort, right? It's concentrated time on something substantive that matters to both the undergraduate and the mentor. So, there's an example. Another example, another key piece of this, and again, you spoke about this in really much more forgiving terms than I'm starkly representing it here, but structured feedback, continuous over time, right? The structure is not just provided at the outset, but it continues and maybe is lessened as the student gets more experience with the project underway. But feedback is our most valuable, I think, and impactful but underused tactic to increase the quality of undergraduate learning. But feedback takes time, right? And then how well can I do this stuff? The public demonstration of competence. There's no substitute for it. It can take different forms, certainly. This is just really one thin example. But where in the undergraduate program, I'll just talk about, in the undergraduate program writ large, do we put students in situations? Sometimes we say, well, there's a capstone seminar and they'll talk about what they learned. Not nearly as powerful, right, as a project or an internship well evaluated or something along the lines of an individual inquiry experience. So when we did a systematic, tried in our own sense, asking very specific questions added on to the NSSE survey, looking at what it is that students said they experienced and the kinds of engagement and outcome patterns they also reported, we found what you already know. So we found that students who got structure and feedback throughout the process, right, benefited more than those who didn't. We also found that if all a student did, and I know this doesn't sound like it could be possible with the people in this room, but there are many students who do research with a faculty member, and really what they do is help collect data. Now, those students benefit, but not to the degree that students do who participate in the entire inquiry cycle. I mean, that's what this conference has been about, and how to get better at moving people through that inquiry, not faster, but get better at moving through the inquiry cycle. So it's this thing we do as scholars, right? And that's what makes for a much more, I'll say, effective, productive experience for undergraduates. So 24% of students on average say they've done a research project as an undergraduate. These are NSSE data. It turns out the best data we have, whether you like it or not. NSSE's got the best data in this arena. And look at Elon. I'll put that hat back on. Look at Elon. And sometimes it's 44%. Sometimes Rod Springer, he rounds up, to 45. But the issue here is about equity-mindedness. Again, something that you've talked about here. Because when you look at the percentage of students who get involved in this kind of work, it's fewer who are first in family, right? It's fewer students of color. It's fewer part-timers. It's fewer older students. We've got plausible explanations for maybe one or two of these categories, but we don't really for the first two, even though we now know from multiple data sources, the stuff I've talked about, the stuff you've been talking about, that students from these categories, not only do they benefit just as much as students who've had parents with college degrees and so forth and so on, but the boost that they get to their performance is even greater, these compensatory effects. So this is a kind of a complicated slide that I probably should have dropped, but who participates matters a lot in terms of what they think they're going to do when they show up. So overall, when we ask students with a different kind of a survey beginning, college student survey, about, it's about a third, but 30% of women and 37% of men, as they are starting university, say, I think I'll do a research project. By the way, it never would have occurred to me to say that when I started college as first in family. I mean, that's a pretty intimidating prospect, I think, at least to what. And of course, it is the case that we do see some students who didn't declare get involved later. But here's the thing. So you got 30% of women who started by saying, who said they wanted to do it, but only a quarter, that's what this represents, only a quarter of those who say, a little bit more than that, who say they wanted to do a research project actually did so. What I'm saying here is that there are many students who come to college who think they're going to do something, but don't, which means we're losing, a marked share. The same is true of men. So of the 37% this is why we only end up with, what did I say we had? 24%. We have a much, many more students come saying, now they may not really know what they're saying, I grant you that, and some people say, well, expectations, they don't really matter, they're just filling out a form, they don't. But I wonder, and I especially wonder about those who come from some of these groups where it's not a natural thing to have said to do, and they end up not doing it. So how do you generate more interest? Some of you have talked about this. Certainly academic advising, even the pre-college socialization stuff. I suspect that Elon, some of these other institutions do it very, very well, letting students know long before they arrive about the opportunities that are available, including the support structures and sometimes financial for that. But there are other offices on the campus we can use as allies in this work. Oftentimes they're busy people too. It doesn't necessarily occur to them on their own that this could be part of a conversation, but we've got plenty of data now. Hopefully we have enough energy and enthusiasm and resources to support more people who want this kind of experience, because it pays off enormously, right? And then there's this faculty thing, which you've spent a lot of time talking about. We've met the enemy and they are us. No, I don't mean that really, do I? So when we ask faculty the question, how important is it for a student who's about to graduate from Elon, I'm using just Elon, these are not Elon data, these are national data. How important is it for a student to have this experience before they graduate? And you can see, a little bit more than half of faculty members agree that this would be a useful thing. I mean, at least we're up to 85% on a capstone culminating experience, even though we probably aren't near that percentage of programs that require a high-quality capstone experience. So that's an issue for us. And the reason it's an issue for us, I love this slide. I hope I can explain it in a way that makes sense to you. So on this, what do we call this? We call this the horizontal axis. This is the average importance that faculty and staff at an institution place on a given experience. I'm showing you just 3 here, right? And again, go figure, undergraduate research is bolded. The average importance that staff say, doing this before you graduate is important, and the percentage of students at institutions who do it. My point? If you believe it's important, somehow the institution will find a way, well, it's because of faculty will and resource allocation. And this is not saying I do it. It's saying that we believe having these kinds of experiences are important to prepare students adequately for whatever it is they're going to come to next. So attitude, motivation, will, that book about indices of quality, where did you go? Tim left. Oh, no, there he is. And then the book that came later, I don't know why you didn't mention all of my books, but we wrote about the invisible tapestry, culture in American colleges and universities. This is a cultural matter, right? Something that Elon has done very, very well, getting people to believe. So, but let's keep in mind, sometimes we get together, like-minded folks, and we kind of wonder why everybody doesn't see the world the way we do. We don't need every faculty member or staff member supervising or mentoring undergraduate research. In fact, I've heard you little snippets here and there. One of the things that stuck in their mind from last night, Brad, is there are some people we don't want to mentor undergrad. Well, but not only that, we don't need everybody to do this. We certainly do. We certainly need critical mass. We certainly need more to do the work well, but we can sometimes get in our own way by acting as if everybody ought to do what it is I do. We certainly need balanced approaches and so on and so forth. And of course, not everything that a student does by way of an undergraduate inquiry experience. I mentioned, if all that student is doing is helping a faculty member collect data, probably little harm will come to the student. But the benefits do not nearly rise to the level as if they participated more fulsomely. And of course, we now know, oh, by the way, this is all about intentionality. All the things you've been building and talking about here, right? And I just want to point out here, this is the Harvard of Northeast Iowa, Luther College. I graduated from Luther. But I don't remember seeing anyone who looked that good when I don't know. So, obviously, the thing we want to do is what you're doing. You know, we want students involved in the entire cycle, structure as it's appropriate, much more at the beginning, less and less and less as the student is better able to take on responsibility. Where, how often, and are we as well prepared, and our colleagues, to get students in situations where they are thinking aloud about their thinking, right? During and after. I mean, things settle in. People discover things that they didn't realize or know or feel or understand until right afterwards. And what's our, I'm saying responsibility, obligation. Let's just keep in mind that while this particular project that you're working with a student on is very important to you, the student, others, there are a lot of other things that can really add value to that student's experience. And we've got to be open and mindful and supportive in ways, and the kinds of conversations you have about study abroad perhaps, or what kind of internship, what kind of capstone seminar, if that's not the source of the inquiry project itself. And so I said at the outset, I'm convinced we now have, thanks to some good work being done out there. I'm not an Eportfolio expert, but what I have read and what I have seen is that an Eportfolio, not just about undergraduate inquiry, but about all the other things that a student's experience, can add another measure, an accentuating feature here. So that's why we've added it. And so one of the best examples of this good work going on is what was called, how many of you know about this C2L project, Connect to Learning? A few of you do. You weren't in that, were you? It's a very impressive set of work. They had a fair amount of funding to do it, but the findings are coming out now. Eportfolio, standing alone, showing the very same kinds of effects, pattern of effects, that undergraduate inquiry shows, learning community, study abroad, internship, and so forth and so on. So there were 24 campuses doing this work, and they created this is what they call a catalyst for learning framework. You know, this isn't the place for us to talk about it. What I'm trying to tease you into is opening up your mind's eye and saying, what kind of vehicle will capture the nuances and depth and meaning and achievement of an undergraduate inquiry project in addition to the paper or the presentation or the poster, right? What other connections should your students be making to other learning experiences that they have had? We're going to see, I think, Eportfolios will, in some form, different forms, of course, will catch fire here. There's another kind of parallel project going on. Some of you may have heard about this, called the Extended Learning Transcript. Have you heard about this project? It's actually being supported. Well, it's got some foundation dollars, but it's what a funny marriage between registrars, academic registrars, and student affairs professionals. Those are the two groups that have come together, because more and more employers are saying, there's nothing on this academic transcript that has any meaning to me. It doesn't represent anything that I can make sense of in terms of what a student can do, let alone what they know. No offense to those of us who record grades religiously and so on and so forth. I've been doing it for 40 years myself. But the extended learning transcript, we used to call things like this a co-curricular transcript back in the day, but this is a much more detailed, I think, meaningful, and it's to bring all kinds of experiences into focus so that, like an electronic portfolio where students are adding pieces as they move through the academic experience, they can see themselves. That's the point here about making their learning visible. They can see, students can see for themselves how they've, let's say, developed as a writer, as a thinker, right, as a problem solver, as they put artifacts of their own work, whether it's papers or project reports, whatever it might be. I think the marriage between ePortfolio and the extended learning, I'm sorry, I called it they call it an extended learning report, not transcript. So there'll be much more qualitative. You know, the group that was talking about journals not accepting qualitative papers, where were you? Was that the 11:15 this morning? That blew my mind away, but for different reasons. Anyway, I'm bullish on the ePortfolio. This is another reason why we'll leave the slides. There's a lot of work. This work's been going on for 25, 30 years, so it's not right out of the box. But I think now we've got enough experience, enough testing that's gone on out there, so I think we'll see this added to the official list of 10, and now we'll have 11. But there are a lot of other things that go on at Elon and at your university that can have very similar effects, like an undergraduate inquiry experience. I'm not going to go into that riff now. I'd love to, but we're almost out of time. A lot of other things. Playing athletics for the right coach. Writing, I guess I am going into the riff. Writing for the student newspaper. Writing for the student newspaper. Students who write for the student newspaper probably are spending as much or more time on that article as any other class project that week. And that article may never get published. And when they turn it in to the daily editor, they get what? Sliced up. They say, I spent more time on the Valentine's Day article for Luther College Chip's weekly newspaper than any other project I did except for my senior paper. Wonderful Valentine's Day article, and they cut it by a third. I said, I'm done. I walked away. That's actually a true story, and I was dumb enough as an undergraduate to do it. So, a lot of things that, part of what you've been doing here these last 3 years is, what Aristotle was encouraging us to do. How do we do this work well, right? Where's the manual, right? Where's the blueprint? What are the 9 steps to heaven or whatever it is we need to take? And of course, just when we think we know, we find more nuance and complexity in our lives. So the only way that we're going to get better, you know this from your own work, at doing what we do, it is to do it. And with the community of practice around us, we're much more willing, I think, to take risks and to get feedback and such. Okay, that ends my formal presentation.